Well, the first charges in plea in the special counsel investigation into Russian interference in the presidential election are now in the books. Former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort and his business associate Rick Gates are accused of hiding more than $75 million they made from work overseas from 2006 to 2016. Now, President Trump distanced himself from that work, saying it wasn't connected to his campaign, but legal analysts say it could be a way to get both men talking. Now, the other big headline, former Trump campaign advisor George Papadopoulos, who pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about conversations he reportedly had with the Russians. Because Papadopoulos pleaded guilty, it could be a sign he may already be giving more ammunition to prosecutors. Now, the president responding to the indictments on Twitter, accusing the fake news of working overtime, writing, as Paul Manafort's lawyer said, there was no collusion, and events mentioned took place long before he came to the campaign. And he writes, few people knew the young, low-level volunteer named George, who has already proven to be a liar.
Of what got George Papadopoulos in trouble was that he lied to the FBI agents.
President Trump's attorney also says the president has no plans to fire special counsel Robert Mueller. The chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee says President Trump doesn't have the power to fire Mueller. He said only Deputy Attorney Rod Rosenstein can do that. Meantime, we've learned one of those men, Rick Gates, has ties to Colorado. According to a 2011 press release, Gates was on the board of a Denver-based ID theft company, and he resigned from his post immediately after the 2016 election. Well, back with us today to talk about all of this, the impact of these indictments, the impact on the White House, Professor Seth Maskett from the University of Denver. And you're the chair of the poli-sci department, I should point out as well, correct?
Just recently. I just finished being chair, actually.
Okay. Well, poli-sci is your area, so we love to talk politics with you on a regular basis. What do you make first of these indictments?
They're very serious, particularly some of the material we were hearing from Papadopoulos' testimony. These are the sort of things that aren't really subject that well to spin. That is, you know, whether we're focusing on this or not, we're talking about very serious legal accusations here. We're talking about very serious talks about corruption and other things that are tied very closely to the White House and to the campaign that brought Trump there.
Yet the president says this is a witch hunt.
Well, yes, he says that, but that in some ways doesn't matter. I mean, of course, he's going to try and distance himself from it, and that makes some sense. But we're also talking about things that are part of these charges that are tied to his own campaign. This was his campaign manager, as well as other people who worked in his campaign. So he's very much enmeshed in this, whether or not he's directly legally culpable for any of this. Where
do you think this investigation could go? I mean, you use the word very serious.
It's hard to say in this case. It seems like what Robert Mueller is doing is he's trying to essentially make deals with some of these people who have received indictments and to get other information about people even closer to the president. And what could happen with something like that is eventually you have accusations coming toward people who are within the president's family or people who are much more closely aligned with him. It could lead to resignations from within the White House. It could lead to Trump kind of lashing out and trying to do some firings, and potentially these are impeachable acts.
Now, there was a recent ABC News Washington Post poll that shows 58% approve of how Robert Mueller is handling the investigation. About half the respondents suspect that President Trump broke the law during the presidential campaign. So how do you interpret those numbers, and do you see the president getting beyond these numbers?
These are very difficult numbers, in particular because of Robert Mueller has a pretty sterling reputation. He's served presidents of both parties. He really, you know, has just a very highly recommended resume for himself. Some Republicans are making a real effort right now to portray him as in some ways biased, in some ways having his own conflicts. But it's difficult to portray him that way simply because he was chosen for this reason of being someone who is essentially considered beyond partisanship and beyond corruption.
Do you think that the word scandal should be used here? I mean, we've had scandals, you know, with President Nixon, President Clinton. Is this along those, I mean, do you rank this the same?
This is up at those levels. I mean, scandal can cover a wide range of things, from everything from an inappropriate tweet or comment to something that is potentially illegal or would subject someone to removal from office. This is up there with those very serious things like what happened during President Nixon or President Clinton's term.
Let's talk about the president's trip to Asia. He's on an extended trip right now. How do you see, well, it's probably good timing for him given these indictments, but at the same time, how do you see China looking at this relationship now with the U.S.?
They are, I would imagine, thinking of this in terms of very long-term interests and long-term relationships between the U.S. and China. Certainly, they have to be aware of the news. They have to be aware of the fact that there are at least discussions of impeachment going on, and there's at least more of a chance of this president not finishing out his term than most others, even if that chance is still pretty high. So while they certainly want to have good relationships with the president, they also recognize that they need to be in this with the United States for the long term.
Do you think that the rest of the world, I should say, is looking at the U.S. with I don't know, with what kind of view would you say, given these incidents that are happening right now?
Well, I mean, the United States just, and whoever the president of the United States is simply can't be ignored. I mean, just due to our economy, our military, our how integrated we are with the way the rest of the world runs. They're certainly paying attention to this. This is one of those things that is hard for foreign leaders to kind of tune out. They want to, be in the president's good graces to the extent possible, but also be cognizant of, the very real difficulties he's facing right now.
Yet here on U.S. soil, the unemployment rate is incredibly low. The stock market's doing incredibly well. Do people really care if they know that they're doing okay right now, day in and day out? Well,
it's interesting. His approval ratings, which most recent that we've seen are somewhere in the mid to high 30s, have not really been consistent with the president who is serving during times of strong economic growth and relative peace and relative low crime and low gas prices. You would expect a president to be much more popular given those sort of basics of the political environment. So the fact that his approval ratings are ranked so low means, people are at least taking that into consideration. They are paying attention to what he's been doing, what he's been saying, and they're in some ways punishing him for that. Now, does that actually translate into votes in the midterm elections or when he runs for re-election? That's much harder to say, obviously.
Yeah, let's talk about the midterms. We have seen a lot of change happening within the Republican Party. Senators Flake and Corker saying that they are stepping away. What do you see happening here in Colorado? Do you think there will be any changes given these what's happening within the party itself?
Well, obviously it's still roughly a year before the midterm elections. The way things are shaping up right now, it would look like the Republican Party will probably be relatively unpopular. The president's party, no matter who that president is, tends to lose seats both in Congress and in state legislatures in a midterm election. When the president is very unpopular, that gets worse. So you can expect a little bit of a headwind, at least for Republicans next year, that even what's going on in D.C. will tend to trickle down to what's going on within the state politics. Now, what sort of an impact that ends up having on an open seat gubernatorial election like we're going to have here is much harder to say, but I would tend to think that Republicans will be facing a little bit of a headwind. Well,
we have a whole lot of candidates to choose from in that next gubernatorial race, so thank you, Seth Maskett, for being here, and I'm sure we'll be talking more as we get closer to those midterms.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.